The commandment, V'haita ach sameach, you shall only indeed be happy, from the book of Deuteronomy. It also says here, Usmachtem, and you shall be happy. And the question for generations is, how can an emotion such as joy or happiness be commanded? Now, it is commanded. I've talked about times when I felt really down in my life and not very optimistic, and I told a person about all my troubles and travails, and they said, I met the person at a sukkah, by the way. I'm walking home. I bump into him, and he says, how's it going? I said, you want me to tell you the truth? How's it going? And I poured my heart out a bit, and he said, but Mordecai, you're supposed to be happy. It's Sukkot. And I said, how can I be happy when all this is happening? He said, that's your problem. And it was a deep moment, that there's a mitzvah to be happy, and therefore, at some point, happy is not the emotional accumulation was happening to you. At some level, it's a choice. I think I read that before, but I took it very deeply because here I am, going through an objectively tough period. I was preparing for my qualifying exams. My GI Bill had run out. I was a single dad, hadn't yet met Mirav, who saved me. And he said, hey, it's your choice. And I thought to myself, wow, there's so many reasons for me to be happy. I just haven't chosen to be happy. Now, the thing I want to emphasize today is backing up the choice can be extremely difficult. So if you know that in general, we should strive for well-being in our lives and even joy at some point, and you know it's a choice, it's like saying, and you'll excuse the analogy, saying to someone who with an addiction, to say to them, oh, you have a choice. Just stop drinking. Just stop taking drugs. Just stop. Just say no. One of the worst things you can say to someone in a 12-step program, just say no. So behind, you have an obligation to be happy. You have an obligation not to use drugs or alcohol in an addictive way. Yeah, that's easy to say. But what does it mean to actually act on the commandment? Now, so let me, as I was thinking about this yesterday, let me share my thought with you. So here it goes. So without singing, try to imagine you hear Judy Garland singing this. Forget your troubles, come on, be happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day. Now, Finley, I just analyzed these lyrics, and it didn't go so well. It's hard to forget the troubles that plague our thoughts and feelings. If you chase your cares away, they might chase you back. Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah is not a happy song, and getting ready for Judgment Day typically does not make us happy. The Jewish holiday of Sukkot has two major commandments. One is easy, unless you're engineering challenged, build a sukkah. The second commandment is difficult for just about everybody, at least some of the time, you shall be happy. In the psychology of transformation that I've been thinking about lately, saying, come on, be happy, to a fearful, worried, angry, hurt, depressed, troubled, or despairing person is worse than saying nothing. It's better to say, I don't know what to say. So I looked up being happy on the internet. There's much good advice that is repeated, I guess, thousands of times. Every website said almost the same thing. Now, just about everybody in America has the internet. So why isn't everyone happier? And it seems getting less and less happier, if the statistics are correct. My first theory, why, in spite of the profusion of websites with advice to be happy, that people are getting less happy, is that reading about happiness makes people unhappy. Okay? I don't fully agree with that theory, but there's something there. My second theory is that advice doesn't really help people suffering from fear, worry, anger, hurt, depression, and despair. I think that's mostly true. If advice worked, after the first book or website, everybody would be happy. Why doesn't advice work? Because most people have a huge inner resistance to following good advice. I want to talk about that more today. Unless they're right about to turn the corner, and a little good advice is all they need. Second, most of the advice that I read lacks several things. For starters, the admission that unhappiness is part of the human condition and therefore inevitable if you are human. So let me just expand from what I'm reading here. If a person says to me, I'm unhappy, in the right place or time, I may say, well, you're human. There's nothing wrong with you. In fact, sometimes in life, to be angry, despairing, depressed, hurt, wounded, guilt, shame, that's exactly what you're supposed to be feeling. Those are appropriate feelings. Those are indicated feelings by what you're going through. So when a person reports to me that they're feeling one of those things, that might be the most authentic feeling or emotion you could have. Okay. So the first thing I think we should say on advice to be happy, I'm going to call it the wisdom of unhappiness. The wisdom of unhappiness is sometimes unhappiness is precisely what you're supposed to be feeling. So for me, one of the problems of advice about unhappiness, anxiety, and so forth is it doesn't dignify the experience. It's not something to get rid of. Unhappiness tells you there's something happening inside of it you have to address. So the first thing, don't get rid of your unhappiness. If I'm going through a tough time, sad, angry, hurt, despairing, wounded, if someone says, come on, Finley, get happy, I'll say, okay, thank you. And realizing that person actually is avoiding my pain. If I have pain and I decide to share it with somebody and they say, oh, come on, get happy, I realize they are actually not able to stand with me in this tough moment. Okay? There are many things to say to a hurting person, and one of them is not, oh, just get over it. Please don't ever say that. Please, please don't ever say to a hurting person, just get over it, time to move on. You don't have any right to say it, and it does more harm than good. The main thing the person knows is you can't take it when they're going through a tough time. That's the main takeaway that I take away. When a person says, how you feeling? I say, you really want to know? They say, yes. And I tell them, they go, oh, just get over it. I say, well, they actually didn't really want to know. They didn't know that I might actually tell them. Second reason most advice, in my mind, doesn't work is the symptoms of unhappiness do look similar. The affect of unhappiness is a core part of our development as human beings. Hold on a second. I don't need to talk with my glasses on. A core part of our the expressions of unhappiness is adaptive as human beings. So when we're sitting, let's say, in the ancient Hamlet 50,000 years ago, and you put on the face of unhappiness, which, remember, is involuntary, it let everybody know you're going through a tough time. And hopefully there was some parent, elder, sage who could come to you and not say, come on, get happy, and say, let's take a walk. So the expressions of unhappiness are evolutionarily required so that the people close to you know that you're suffering. So to say to a person, come on, get over it, is not what the expressions of sadness are there for from an evolutionary perspective. And secondly, the affect of unhappiness is evolutionarily, psychologically required by the human condition. The inner causes of unhappiness are widely diverse. So you might say one small set of symptoms, vast causes. And therefore, the advice that I read, the 10 things you need to do, I have one printed out next to me. What they don't say is, most of this advice might not work for you because, theoretically, every unhappiness is different. The symptoms look the same. The causes are different. So when I look at the how to treat despair, sadness, etc., and they give you the 10 things, none of them might work for you. One of them might work for you. But the idea where a person has said, I read the book, I have a couple of books here, and it doesn't help. What's wrong with me? The book is right. I read the book. It's really convincing. I try this stuff. Nothing helps. So I think the first thing we should say is, I'll just repeat, unhappiness is part of the human condition. It's a required part of the human condition. There's wisdom in unhappiness, and it's not something to just get over and put your troubles behind you. There's wisdom and unhappiness to tell you there's suffering deep in the soul that needs your careful attention. Don't try to get rid of unhappiness. Don't try to just get rid of your despair, your sadness, your ruminating. We should work it through because we ought to live lives of well-being, but we can't hurry through it. We can't hurry through it. All right, so I'll call the wisdom of unhappiness, the vast array of causes of unhappiness. Now, one reason I think some of the advice doesn't work, and I'll share with you some of the work that I do, not advice, but work that I do, is that as people try to think about their unhappiness and understand themselves and life itself, are bound to fail because people don't understand themselves and life. I want to preview something I want to say next. So one of the books I have here is a book on mindfulness. And again, I'm not against mindfulness, but it's a very cloudy term, which is one reason I don't use it. Going back from my teachings before the high holidays, mindfulness is something like forgiveness, which means people love to use the term, but nobody agrees on what it means. And as I read this book, they favor first of all, a sense of rising above your unhappiness, contemplating your unhappiness, and then, as it were, locking yourselves into the present, because the present doesn't make you unhappy, it's just the past or the external world. And I read this and I thought to myself, they are saying cognitive psychology is good, but the profoundly difficult world of actually figuring out what's happening, which is difficult for people, and therefore the difficulty in finding out what to do next. I'll give you a few examples of that. So another reason that I think the general advice doesn't help, because the skill of finding out what is actually happening within you, what the facts of your life are, and how to move through it is very complex, and it's much more than do a contemplative practice. I think is a required beginning place, but it's an opening into a lifetime of very deep, precise, and detailed work. And the last thing is when you read the advice, the sense of, well, if I do these 10 things, I'll be happy, as opposed to saying, you'll have to do some, all, or more than these 10 things for the rest of your life. Happiness is not something you achieve, it's something toward which you aspire, and you might fall short depending on your personality. So if you're not happy, you might just be engineered that way. That might be part of your heritage. It's not something that's wrong with you. It's actually part of how your personality works. Some people are up and effervescent and bubbly, and other people actually operate their lives at I'll say, a much lower key. So for a person whose default position, and I'm not saying this in a pathological sense, but a little bit depressive, to say to that person, be happy, is a violation of their personality. It might be a violation of their character. And using a phrase I like nowadays, it might be a violation of their superpower. I remember one person talking about depression with me, and I gave them the James Hillman interpretation that I gave you on the high holidays. James Hillman says, one thing that depression is, putting aside chronic and you might say clinical depression, but just the sense of depressed, not connecting with the world, not feeling motivated, not able to get your life together. Hillman says, and I fundamentally agree with him, for some people, some of the time, it's a call from the soul to come deep and pay attention to the wounds inside the soul. So when your soul is hurting and sends up a message, disconnect from the outside world. Disconnect from your life on the surface. Come down deep, because there's work to do. To ignore that, to do something else instead, might be a violation of how your inner life works. So I said to one person, depression might be a request from the soul to experience your pain and interpret your life in a deep way. The person said to me, you mean depression might be my superpower? I had never heard that before. I said, bingo. Depression might be your superpower. So again, another reason why, as I read these things, I mean, they're very well intentioned. And what are you going to say in 5 pages on a website or even 100 pages in a book? It's not the same thing as doing the work. So I'm looking at it and think to myself, it's all a good start. But if I were to write such a book, and I think I might, I would start with the wisdom of unhappiness, the wisdom of despair, the wisdom of depression, the wisdom of anger, the wisdom of resentment. By the way, at this point, some people say to me, but Rabbi Finley, I thought you said we're not supposed to be angry. I've never said those words in my life. What I've said is, in the interpersonal field, reduce expressions of anger because it only makes things worse. Anger is real. Anger is indicated by things we go through. Anger is one of the ways that we process the world. Something's gone terribly wrong. My teaching is to lash out at another person in the interpersonal space will likely make your life worse unless the other person has great capacity for forbearance, is willing to take a tough moment, and you can reset yourself. So I want to because I've heard this from many people. People said, I thought you shouldn't express your feelings. My response is, to your therapist, express your feelings all you want, but don't express toxic feelings about somebody onto that person for very long. It won't go well. So I just want to be super clear. Your feelings feelings and emotions are an interpretation of what's happening in your soul. So we have to go through the feelings and emotions to get down what's happening in the soul. If I can just review these things, what's happening with unhappiness, why advice doesn't work, or it has to be much more subtle. Unhappiness is part of the human, all the versions of unhappiness are part of the human condition. The symptoms are similar. The causes are very diverse. The human tendency not to understand themselves and life itself, and therefore the attempts to gain well-being are bound to fail because they lack understanding. And gaining well-being is not something you do as a fix. You don't follow the advice and get happy and stay there. It's lifetime work. And for some people whose personalities run a little bit darker, you can burst into a few moments of deep joy and well-being, but you're going to get back to your set point. And I don't think we ought to tell people not to be who they are. I mean, you can say to a person, hey, what's wrong with you? Say, I just run at a little bit lower energy. I have a somewhat depressive view of life. Why? I tend to be that way. I have a little bit, when I say to people, but you look so happy when you teach. Well, when I teach, I'm not in my contemplative world. I say, I run a little bit depressed. Why? I say, because I read history. Because I read the newspaper. With the history that I read and the news that I read, my heart aches for the human condition. My heart aches for human suffering. I've said to people many times, I taught Holocaust for 10 years straight at USC. I watched those movies for 10 years straight. I walked my students from the beginning of anti-Semitism right into the camps for 10 years straight. I interviewed Holocaust survivors sitting right across from me who told me their horrific stories for 10 years straight. And I remember I talked to another Holocaust teacher, and I opened up. I said, I've been wounded by this. I've been wounded. I can't see the world otherwise. I've shared this thought before. It's a bit of a dark thought, but sometimes when I would go to synagogue and look at all you here, and I'd see these bright, shining, wonderful faces, here's a really uncontrollable thought. They would have killed you, and 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 they would have murdered your children and your parents and your brothers and so everybody you love. That's what I think when I see a room full of people. And it's an automatic thought. It doesn't make me happy. I have to get a hold of it. It's involuntary. It doesn't make me happy. Now, should I ignore it, or should I feel the suffering of other people? Now, some people say, well, don't think about it. My response is, I'd rather think about it. I'd rather think about it and say Kaddish and grieve and be unhappy because of their suffering that I read about. I don't want to ignore them. I wish I had time in my life to grieve every single one of them individually. That's one reason I love Stephen Greinberg's. Mirav and I are both in deep appreciation of Stephen Greinberg, that on Holocaust Day, he has a website where you can light a candle. And each time you go to light a candle, you get a name. I meditate on that name with as much information as possible. All this is a way of saying sometimes the most authentic way to deal with life is to feel sadness and grief and not chase it away, either about life in general or about your life. Sometimes life goes horribly wrong. We don't want to ignore our grief. We don't want to ignore our sadness. All right, so that's the first thing about when the Torah says, Usmachtem v'hitach sameach, and you shall only be happy. You say, I get it. Our lives should have moments of great joy. You hear my 4-step key to life. Do your duty. Find bliss when possible. Be resilient when you can't find bliss, and everything matters. Well, the first thing is do my duty. And I think we have a duty to grieve. And I think we have a duty to be present to our feelings. I think we have a duty, this is an inner spiritual duty, not to run away from our emotions and feelings, to understand the emotions and feelings are drawing us into a deep place. Now, in that life of deep sentience as a human being, in that life of deeply feeling our feelings, for some people, they have a moment and then they go back to their effervescent, bubbly self. That's their personality. Great. I love to be around those people. I'm not one of them, but I love to be around those people. On the other hand, I think for other people, it's find bliss when you can, and I try to do that. And then I'm going to go down to my set point, which is part of who I am. And quoting the person who I was counseling, I never thought about it this way. It might be my superpower, that I know how to go deep into the interior realms, the deep chambers of my soul, and find out what's going down in that shadow cavern and bring up and share what I teach other people. For some people it resonates, for some people it doesn't. Okay, let me see how I finished my article. Hold on. All advice should start with a warning. None of this is likely to work if you're not willing to work. Okay, and then I linked to my article I wrote back in, I think, 2018 on happiness for the Jewish Journal. I put a link in my preface to my Shabbat thought. I just reread it. I could change a couple of words, but I think it's still a very good piece of work on the problem of happiness. It's several pages long, but go and take a look at it. All right, so what does that mean for all of us here? A little bit on the, inside of what I taught. Let's say you realize this. You agree with everything that I say, but you say, genug, it's enough. It's time. I'm fixating. I'm obsessing. I'm on a wheel that I can't get out of. I'm grinding. I need some relief. Let's say that's you. You've decided that it is time to move forward. What skills are there to use? So I just want to give you a few skills today. One of them is what I call a contemplative practice that I don't call mindfulness, because the word mindfulness means too many things to too many different people. See, one thing mindfulness can mean, according to some places that I read, is be present. Be only in the present. So you're mindful of the present moment. I think that's good sometimes, but sometimes you need to be mindful of your past. You need to be mindful of your wounds. So if my mind, what I'm going to call my conscious state, wants to visit wounds, I'm not going to say, well, I can't do that because mindfulness means being in the present. No, sometimes my soul wants me to go deep inside. So I call it a contemplative practice, because what I mean is rising above the field of consciousness. Ideally, the field of consciousness is, I call it aware of my surroundings. I'm aware of you, you're aware of me. So we're living in this moment. Now, there are natural, pleasant distractions. People daydream. They go into a fugue state. That's okay as long as you're not driving your car or in a crosswalk, okay? I mean, in a crosswalk, we should probably be pretty aware of what we're doing. So in general, you want to be aware of your surroundings, but it's okay to daydream, zone out, go into a fugue. But eventually, it's ideal most of the time to be aware of where you are, what your surroundings are, and what you're doing. I hope there's consensus there. Another part of what I call the field of consciousness is attuned. Sometimes you need to be attuned, deeply attuned to what you're doing, not generally aware, but focused aware. For example, I'm attuned to what I'm teaching. I did a lot of preparation for today. Of course, I don't write anything out. So I'm attuned to my inner preparation, the organization that I've prepared. It's all sitting down here in a file, and I'm trying to bring things out one file at a time. So I'm very attuned to the memorized file that I have inside of me to bring out to you. Okay, so I call that attuned. The third quality of what I would call an ideal state of consciousness or field of consciousness is adaptive. Things come up all the time. Something that you didn't plan for, something that got in the way of your being attuned. And what happens is we can get rigid, angry, upset, flustered, etc., lose the train of thought, as this happened to me. So we have to be very adaptive. For example, as you just saw, if I lose my train of thought, I don't mind a couple of moments of silence. I'll just sit here and say, lost my train of thought. Give me a second, right? It's okay. We can all take a couple of minutes of quiet, right? Especially from a guy who likes to talk a lot. So the other one thing is adapt. And I think we have to train ourselves to be adaptive. When I was younger, I've talked about this before, I would give a beautiful talk and I would get heckled and I would get upset. It's like I prepared hard for this and I got a room of 100 people and you raise your hand and you give me a hard time. And I was mystified and offended why someone would come to a talk of mine to give me a hard time. I didn't adapt well. And I realized that's one reason people come to talks where people entertain questions is to give a hard time to the speaker. That's what they paid for. And I realized, I think about Eric Byrne, it's the game. You're trying to be earnest, I will mess you up. It's a game. So I realized the worst thing I can do is say, I can't believe you're giving me a hard time. It's like, okay, that's what you're programmed to do. So I'm going to be programmed to just get through this. And it took a while for me to learn how to be adaptive as a speaker. Of course, I have a limit. There are times I have to set kind, clear, firm boundaries and say, okay, time for you to stop, time for me to move on. That's part of my adaptation technique. Just want to give you an example. I had to learn how to adapt and the many levels of adaptation. So I'm going to recommend that to you. Aware, attuned, adaptive. Okay? And in adaptive is resilient, think on your feet, be agile, etc. And the fourth one is accountable. I call these are my 4 A's. I could have picked a different letter. I could do this much longer, but I like aware, attuned, adaptive, accountable. It's not a complete list. It's just easy to memorize, and they all begin with the same letter. By accountable, I mean you're able to realize that was a mistake. What I just said, did, responded, you say to yourself, that was a mistake in a non-defensive way. And if the situation allows, say, I apologize, that was a mistake. I took that the wrong way. I blurted that out. I want to retract it. One problem is many people, once they say something, they double down and defend it. Okay, so that's why I say aware, attuned, adaptive, accountable. Now, what happens is, just as we go into fugue states and daydream and old memories come up and a piece of music comes into your head, so I don't think we should rigidly try to stay in this what I call 4A state. Sometimes negative things come up from the unconscious ego self. They come into the field of consciousness, which we might try to push out the feeling, but I'm feeling upset, I'm angry, I'm afraid, I'm anxious, I'm despairing, I'm depressed. It comes up and begins to load into the field of consciousness or the state of consciousness. It's hard to be aware because that becomes a lens or a prism by which you see the world. It's hard to be attuned because it's saying, be attuned to me. It's hard to be adaptive because it's taken over your field of consciousness. And it's hard to be accountable, especially when something like anger, resentment comes in. So those negative ego states, I call them, when they come up into the field of consciousness, it's very difficult to me what I call the A state. What I recommend to people is create the skill of adaptivity where I say, I know you're there. I'm not talking to you now. I got to get through this talk. I got to get through this discussion. I'll talk to you later. So I've learned a skill just to quiet down unconscious ego states, especially the ones that bespeak unhappiness and all these, the different kinds of unhappiness. Then later, I have to address them. So how do I address them? In this contemplative practice, now I don't have to be in my A state. I'm in a different state. I start with the observer mind, which some people call mindfulness. And I'm reminding you something I've taught often, but today's another day to teach it. And that is observe what is happening inside of me. Don't deny it. Don't edit. Don't explain it. By the way, you don't ideally talk about this unless you're with a trained professional, but you can just observe what's happening. And the main thing is spend some quiet time just observing the stream of consciousness in a relaxed, non-judgmental way. Just see it. Now, I don't say it's true, it's right, to bless it, to embrace it, because it might be really wrong. Let me develop that. I might have a feeling based on something I fabricated. There are many times when a person, I have gotten really upset, I had a very strong feeling of being upset. You take it to another person, and they say, that never happened. Or a person, when I counsel people, they have a story to tell, creates strong feelings. So instead of observing the feelings, they identified with the feelings, they believed the thought behind the feeling, and then they went and operated on it. So in that first observer mind, you don't say right or wrong. You don't give any judgment. You try to disidentify and just watch the feeling. So that's what I call the observer mind. And that might be a mindfulness practice, but it's only the beginning. So if you want to work through negative emotions, the unhappy ones, the first thing is a contemplative state where you can just watch it. The next thing, as most of you know, I call the objective mind, where you're doing a few things. One is you're naming. So in the observer mind, you're more watching, and what I call the objective mind, you say, I want to give this a name, and I want to start moving to see objectively what the thought behind the feeling is, because all feelings have a thought behind them, so you want to hear the thought. And the start of asking for yourself is whether this thought, feeling, or emotion is connected to reality. Now, people then say, but I'm using thought to examine thought. Yes, but here's where the word thought means two different things. There's involuntary thought. That person is horrible. They did an awful thing. This is inexcusable. Those are thoughts. But you rise above it to what I call a higher self-thought, objective thinking that says, maybe they didn't. Maybe I have it all wrong. Maybe I'm telling myself a big story. So in objective, I call this higher self-thinking. You are naming it, whatever, depression, despair, anger, sadness, fear, you're naming it. Then you want to go to the objective mind, where you've named it, and then you want to investigate it and see if it's telling the truth, and if it is telling the truth, to say it in a pretty square, even way. To say not with the drama, not with all the feelings packed into it. The feelings are down in the unconscious ego self. But to look at it objectively, I can say, wow, I'm really afraid, which is very different from being in the fear. I'm really grieving, which is a bit different from being in the grief. So in the objective mind, I'm looking down and I'm noticing it, and I'm going to a higher self kind of processing. I'm not disconnecting from it. I'm not avoiding it. I'm not living in the present, as it were. I'm living present to what is happening in my unconscious ego self. Now, even living objectively present to what is happening in your unconscious ego self is itself part of the healing of the inner life. So here's where some theology is going to come in. I'll add a little bit more theology as we go along. If there's some light in the further reaches of the higher self, just moving into the objective mind starts to bring down the light. The light of consciousness is healing for the unconscious ego self, because you're disidentifying, you're disconnecting from that, which means you are automatically, perforce, opening yourself to this higher light. And then I have a few more levels of the higher self. I don't want to take the time to go into them today. I'll be teaching about that in my classes coming up. But here's a thought that I have, more Kabbalistically, is that, I mentioned this a bit last night, that in every one of these thoughts, there's a spark that's waiting to come forth. For example, let's say I've counseled people who have gone through very difficult breakups. Things have come apart. And they're very angry at the other person, or angry at themselves, and they don't understand what happened, are very resentful. They have this could have been handled differently. Why didn't they do this? Why didn't I do that? It's just a jumble of thoughts. And so remember, when you go to the objective mind, the next mind is the rational mind. You just try to clear it all out. What are they thinking? What are the facts? Look at what happened. And the one thing I realize is people are avoiding what I call the truth of the situation. That's the next level. Observer mind, objective mind, rational mind, truth mind. There's a truth of the situation that I'm just avoiding, because to say it would be way too sad. A relationship has a trajectory. It's like a Greek tragedy. It's headed toward its demise. The hero is headed toward destruction. There's an unseen flaw, hamartia, they say it in Greek. There's an unseen flaw that's going to get manifested, and a person is going through life with high intentions. They think they're conscious, and then in a beautifully constructed drama, they meet the moment when they realize it's not possible. I've been lying to myself. I haven't accepted the facts, and boom, they get to that place. Now, in the beautiful tragedy, the hero admits. The hero comes to consciousness, and they accept. This is the nature of life. This is the human condition. I came square up against the human condition, all the aspects of the human condition, and I'm not exempt. I am facing the human condition that countless humans before me have experienced and countless humans after me have experienced. I'm experiencing the sharp edge of the human condition. Now, there are a few ways to get it through it. When you hit the sharp edge of the human condition, and the truth of it is, you should be sad. You should be depressed. You should be despairing. Those are the most natural and authentic reactions. And then another truth comes up and says, but that's not how I want to stay forever. Now, some people get stuck in resentment, despair, depression, and they say, I want to get out. There's another truth. And the truth is, I think we have a spiritual obligation not to stay there. So one of the processes for working these things out, I call, this is one version of the observer, objective, rational mind, which is what exactly is going on? What are all the information I have? What's my theory behind this? And then the truth mind, which for me means accepting the sad truth of the matter, and then getting what you might call the higher truth of the matter, which is, what do I do next? Now that this is true, now that this is the hard parameters of what I'm going through, I got all the facts straight, and I'm not going to be able to change the facts very much. The truth of life boxes us into a certain point. What many people do is, I wish this weren't here. I wish that wasn't there. I'd like this not to be true. Now, people do this unconsciously. There's a certain point where the objective, rational person accepts the relatively fixed parameters of the human condition or a given condition. I'm not saying there aren't miracles. I'm not saying there aren't incredible breakthroughs. We've had a few miracles in our life that completely broke our parameters and our expectations of what is happening. So I'm always open to a miracle. I just don't rely on miracles. I think the first thing is that, as Freud taught, be reality-based. Here is the reality in which I'm living. And it makes me really sad and depressed and despair. Okay, that's true. You got all the way to the truth of the matter. The higher truth is, what am I going to do next? And that's where choice comes in. But you see, for me, the choice doesn't come at the beginning. Come on, be happy, just get out of it. For me, the choice is earned. The choice is earned from deep, difficult, painful, precise, insightful work that might take, for a highly conscious and diligent person, it might take weeks, it might take months. to get to the truth of the matter. So there's some part of our suffering which is indicated, but then there's other parts of our suffering, how long we suffer, the intensity, the duration, which at some level, in my mind, I don't mean to be judgmental about this, but you haven't got to the higher truth is, what am I going to do next? Am I just going to stay here? So the last thing I want to say today is that one reason I think people suffer unnecessarily, and again, I hope this doesn't sound too judgmental, and it's just an observation that applies maybe to a tiny percentage of humanity. Sometimes to me, maybe sometimes to you. And that there is an addictive quality to negative thinking. There's an addictive quality to worrying. I've talked to people where we laid out the parameters, right? This is hard, only way forward is this, and you're working in this limited options. So, sometimes I talk about this mathematically. Here are the factors. 1, 2, 3. Box 4 is blank, and 5, and it equals, here's what I got to do next. Person says, why am I still worrying? And we've added up 1, 2, 3. I can see a blank 4 as the person listening. And 5. Answer is, here are my options, A, B, or C, and got to move forward. Person says, but I'm worrying. So sometimes I wait and I say, well, we have an open box on the Excel sheet. We have all the factors clear. Everything is precise. Everything is rational. Everything is accurate. Bottom line, here are your options. So what's the worrying about? Because everything's super clear. You know what's in the open box? Addiction. Addiction to worrying. Addiction to despair. Addiction to grief. It's a hard thing to admit where you say to yourself, I think I know what I got to do next. Here are all the factors. Here's the factors of my life. Here's what life is about. Here's the higher truth. Something in there is keeping us there. And I would say it's from the shadow, an unseen force of the unconscious ego self that wants us to be there. For some people, it's the addiction to be confused, because if they saw the truth of the matter, they might be too sad to say, wow, I'm like this. That person is like that. They're like that. I mean, to admit the truth of the matter is very hard for people. It's grievous for people. And sometimes as a person recounts what's going on, I look at the box and I say, there's the truth of the matter. And the person says, well, what is it? And, sometimes I'll say to a person, well, I don't know if you know this, but you're very judgmental and harsh to this other person. And they look at me like, how dare you? And they go, yeah, you're right. And, they feel inept around you. And says, yeah. Okay. I said, all right. There's a truth. So, okay. Now, the problem is you can't give someone the truth of the matter until they're ready, because they'll just get upset. Sometimes I look at myself and I look at all things going on inside of me, and I say to myself, what's the truth of the matter that I'm avoiding? What do I not want to see? Because it would break up my worldview about myself or the world in general. So I would just want to offer this to you. And again, I'm only giving the outline of a discussion. If you look at all of this and you say to yourself, I still can't get out of it, it might be that you're hiding from the truth of the matter. All right, so my main point in all of this today was to share with you that I believe in the commandment, you shall indeed be happy. Going back to the mitzvah of Sukkot, the question is, are they really booths that we're commanded to dwell inside of, or are they clouds of glory? One of the clouds of glory, one inversion is the majestic presence of God, and we should live inside that, absolutely. Living inside the majestic, beautiful cloud of glory, of love and radiance and beauty, is an absolute commandment. And it can be very healing and very profound. And then you have to deal with the facts of your life and not avoid the facts of your life. So there's something of a dialectic going on between cultivating states that are nourishing and then actually dealing with the disruptions of the unconscious ego self, because they're real, they're happening in the soul, they're calling you down. And so for Sukkot, I'm going to say we have a mitzvah to work toward well-being. Part of that is bringing down the clouds of glory. And part of it is doing the deep, deep work in the darkness of the unconscious ego self. And you might say the human being is somewhat equipoised between these two things as we move through our lives.